Welcome, everyone. My name is Charlie Plyben. I'm the Oregon Policy Manager for Surfrider Foundation. And tonight we are going to be doing a little program for you, Climate Change and the Future of Oregon Beaches. We're going to wait just a couple minutes here and let folks join. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started while folks are joining. Again, my name is Charlie Plyben. I'm the Oregon Policy Manager for Surfrider, and I thank everyone so much for joining us this evening. It is a beautiful night out here on the Oregon coast, and I know it's hard for folks to be inside probably, and there's a bit of Zoom fatigue out there too. So we appreciate you guys joining us. Oregon's public beaches are super special to us all, and they're really important to Surfrider Foundation and Surfrider members. And one of the largest impacts and trade-offs that we're going to face in the wake of climate change is sort of the future of our public beaches. Where we'll have access, which beaches will be armored and have shoreline protection structures sort of blocking the public beaches. Climate exacerbated events like increased storm activity and sea level rise, increase of erosive forces are all sort of narrowing this fragile margin that's so important to us as our public beaches. And so that's really what we're going to be talking a little bit about tonight. I'm really excited for some of our panelists that'll be joining us. Again, my name's Charlie. I'm the Oregon Policy Manager for Surfrider, and I'm just going to be kicking us off here quickly. And I'm going to turn it over next to Jay Sinowald from Oregon Parks and Recreation Department. He's the Ocean Shores Coordinator. He's going to talk to us a little bit about the beach bill and about the public beaches, but also about sort of that narrow margin and the constraints of shoreline development adjacent that, and sort of what his agency is responsible for in supporting both the public right, but also that of folks that own homes along the beach. Meg Reed is with the Department of Land Conservation and Development. And she works really on the land use side. So just behind the beach end of things, she's really coordinating and working with local governments on land use decisions, where houses may be built in the first place and where development may go and where it may go in the future. And so we're going to hear from her next. And then after that, we're going to have our featured keynote here tonight is Peter Ruggiero from Oregon State University. He's with the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences. Peter is one of my favorite beach scientists. He does what I like call scenario planning, and he can kind of use some models and other things to forecast the policy decisions that we make today for what our beaches and trade-offs might look like in the future. So it's a really valuable way of sort of scientifically looking at and thinking about proactively how we might manage our beaches in the future. So before we get into our program, I just want to quickly mention that Surfrider Foundation really has a four-pronged strategy around climate change. We work on education and outreach, which is kind of what we're doing this evening, talking to folks and educating folks. We're really going to be talking mostly tonight about number 2 up here, which is shoreline planning, a big part of the climate change impacts to the coast or these shrinking beaches. So that requires shoreline managing. Mitigation is another area that we work on. And then we work on policy advocacy around all of these sort of areas. So this is sort of the four-pronged strategy that Surfrider uses to combat climate change. And again, tonight, we're really going to be talking primarily about shoreline planning. So what does shoreline planning for public beaches mean? Well, to Surfrider, that really means putting the beaches and the public trust first. That means being able to access the beach, being able to walk on the beach, being able to enjoy the dry, sandy beaches for the public, and not for just an individual homeowner or an individual person. We really believe that this is a public right. And many people sort of take that as their right here in Oregon, or a birthright through the beach bill. And you're going to learn a little bit more about that as well. We support adaptation planning. That is to say that we want to avoid shoreline armoring, we want to avoid holding the line, and consider how do we plan for the future to mitigate and adapt to a changing shoreline rather than try and hold Mother Nature back. We support non-structural alternatives. So you're going to hear a little bit more about that. What are the differences between shoreline armoring and non-structural alternatives tonight as well. And of course, land use. We support a lot of things through land use. So setbacks for buildings, rebuilding restrictions, requiring homes that are built in hazard areas to maybe not be rebuilt or require them to be rebuilt in certain ways or in certain places. And then certainly resilient relocation. These are things like managed retreat, moving back rather than holding the line, are certainly big shoreline planning strategies that Surfrider endorses for supporting our public beaches. So with that, I am going to sort of wrap up my sort of portion here, and I'm going to turn it over to Jay Sinewald from Oregon Parks and Recreation Department. Jay, would you want to share your screen?
Sure, Charlie. Thanks for the introduction. And let's get started here. Can you all see that? And hopefully you can see that so I can go to my slideshow from the beginning. Everybody see my screen?
Perfect.
Okay.
Perfect.
So Oregon Parks and Recreation Department has the key management responsibility for Oregon's beaches, and our management responsibilities are spelled out in statute and rule. And the management of our beaches depends on blending a variety of issues, users, and jurisdictions that have a stake in Oregon's beaches. It's a complicated task. So to start with, Oregon's Beach Bill, for those not completely familiar with it, was enacted in 1967, and it gives the public free and uninterrupted use of the beaches on all 362 miles of Oregon's coastline. And it's administered as the Ocean Shore State Recreation Area. And my agency is responsible for the protection and preservation of the recreation, scenic, natural, and other resource values that the public holds. So again, the Beach Bill, one of the first things that was done was to establish a boundary, a jurisdictional boundary, and that was done by surveying points that generally followed along the line of vegetation. And each of those lines, points, was connected by a line that's currently known today as the statutory vegetation line. And that again defines the upland boundary of the ocean shore that we manage. Here's an example of a map that we still use today, and it shows the survey points that are circled in red here, and then the dash line between the points shows the statutory vegetation line. And there's several resources available to the public to zoom in on a particular area and find out where the statutory line is in relation to the beach in their area. So here's an example of how the beach moves over time. And I'm going to finish my short presentation with some other photos that really illustrate this. But in 1967, in most of Oregon's beaches, the statutory line and where the line of vegetation was somewhere out seaward of where the actual line of vegetation is now. And so under the current regulations, the ocean shore is defined as the land lying between extreme low tide of the Pacific Ocean and the statutory vegetation line as described in statute, or the line of established upland shore vegetation, whichever is further landward. And here's an example of a cross-section of what that looks like. So here's extreme low tide here, the statutory vegetation line, where the vegetation line essentially was back in 1967. And over the course of time, with the forces of erosion and the dynamics that the beach brings with it, the actual line or the current vegetation line would be somewhere landward of where the statutory line has been in the past, or was, or still is actually. Here's a little bit better illustration of that on the ground. The yellow line represents where the statutory vegetation line was is and was in 67, and then the red dashed line represents the line of established upland shore vegetation today, and OPRD's jurisdiction moves with the erosion. And so in this case, this is where our jurisdictional boundary is. So state parks administers permits for alterations of the ocean shore, including shoreline protection structures. That's the main purpose of this conversation tonight. So I'm going to focus on this. Other types of non-structural measures. We'll talk about that here in just a minute. I'll show you an example. And emergency permits and sand alterations, all related to erosion and accretion. And dune grading also has a component of shoreline protection, but I'm really not going to get that much into it tonight. So shoreline protection structures, the most common form that we see on the Oregon coast are structural shoreline protection structures such as riprap and seawalls. A lot of people don't think of it, but jetties are actually shoreline protection structures as well. To a much greater degree and in their enormity to be able to withstand the forces of the ocean. We're gonna stick to shoreline protection structures that are protecting upland development, private development primarily here. So other types of protection structures could include bioengineered structures such as burritos, soil burritos, gabions, other types of geotextile bags that are filled with sand or rock or other types of filler. Those can be considered bioengineered, but they are still considered structural. And then, of course, we have non-structural methods such as cobble placement, otherwise known as cobble berms or dynamic revetments, sand nourishment, driftwood placement, and vegetative approaches to slow or mitigate erosion. So for shoreline protection measures, state parks requires permits for any project more than 50 cubic yards of filler removal. And an application requires an analysis of hazard avoidance alternatives, including relocation of buildings or infrastructure, increasing setbacks before the structures are built, thinking ahead and using proper land use regulations to ensure that buildings won't be put in harm's way. But there's other factors that come into play, such as, limits on the size of a lot, topographic limitations, and limited opportunities for relocation. For example, finding another lot in the neighborhood or something like that. So for projects 50 feet or greater in length, a geologic report is required, and the geologist has to address certain issues, including potential impacts on the local sand source. For example, if riprap is placed, is that how is that going to affect the supply of sand on the shoreline, for example? What's going to happen to the bank or bluff stability on the adjacent properties? What's going to happen to the neighbors? That has to be considered. And also a thorough review of potential non-structural methods of trying to mitigate erosion, including vegetative stabilization, dynamic revetments, or these non-structural types of approaches that I just mentioned previously, beach nourishment, or other types of approaches that are more creative but don't have a permanent or a hard negative effect on the beach. So we consider several different factors when we look at these. And by the way, our process involves, it's a very public process. So for every application for shoreline armoring or shoreline protection projects, we have a 30-day public comment period. And all members of the public are welcome to comment on applications or request public hearings. And for those properties or projects where we have a lot of interest, it's not totally uncommon to have 10 or more public hearing requests, in which case the agency will post a second notice announcing the time and date of a public hearing. And after the public hearing, we have additional time to write a staff report and issue a written decision on the application. So We consider all of the following in our evaluations. Project need, is the project justified? Are there alterations to the project or modifications? What are reasonable alternatives that should be considered? Is there room to move the house back? If the house can be moved back, then it should be moved back unless the cost of moving the house is greater than the cost of the actual shoreline protection structure, which are quite expensive. Compliance with LCDC goals, and I think Meg is going to speak to goal 18 and its importance in evaluating these types of requests. Can they minimize damage to the scenic attraction of the ocean shore? What are the impacts going to be to recreational use and recreation access? Is the structure going to be properly designed, and is it going to withstand severe wave attack during big storms? How can it be designed and constructed to minimize damage to natural resources? And what is public opinion? So all of these factors are evaluated before we issue a decision. And by the way, ocean shore alteration permits can all be appealed to an administrative law judge who has no affiliation with the agency. So moving through real quickly, I think most of our members are familiar with riprap. Here's a picture of typical riprap. This happens to be at Glen Eden Beach near Lincoln City. This sort of is what typical riprap structures look like. As you can see, during high tide, riprap can project out onto the beach and can create problems for using the beach as a north-south corridor for recreation beach users and pedestrians who want to travel along the shoreline. Here is an example of a seawall, clearly a structural approach to shoreline protection. This one happens to be one of the oldest seawalls in the state of Oregon. This is at Nye Beach in Newport. It's held up pretty well, and it's still performing today. And however, most of our applications that we see don't include concrete seawalls. They usually are riprap type structures that are proposed. And then Charlie will appreciate this. This is a house down near Coos Bay, and relocation is one of the preferred alternatives to shoreline armoring. This home here was successfully relocated after a lot of involvement with Surfrider and encouraging the property owner to, because they had room to move the house back, that was actually what was accomplished. The house was jacked up and put on cribbing, and a new foundation was poured behind it, and they successfully moved the house back. So this is one good success story where shoreline armoring was not the result of mitigation efforts. This is an example of a non-structural approach. This is at Cape Lookout State Park, and this is what's known as a dynamic revetment or a cobble berm, where naturally occurring materials, in this case, these cobbles, were harvested from a portion of the beach not far from the site and transported down to the campground at Cape Lookout, where there was some severe erosion that was actually impacting infrastructure. We actually lost a public restroom building and some campsites and a water line and some other things. And so this was the preferred method for state parks, trying to lead by example and using a non-structural approach. And today it's still effective in protecting the park. A lot of people, when they go to the park and walk down the beach trails, they don't even realize that this is a man-made approach using natural materials. It just looks natural. So before I get off here and turn it over to Meg, I thought I'd show you a pretty stark look at what happens when shoreline armoring is installed and the erosion continues. This happens to be in Tillamook County. This is the Shorewood RV Park. It's about a mile north of the north jetty of Tillamook Bay. And this is what the shoreline looked like in front of the park and around the park in 1997. And here's what it looks like today, because the erosion has continued on the north and south flanks of that riprap. And as you can see, the comparison is just shocking, how far it's been eroded. And at this point, the erosion has taken almost 180 feet of shoreline since the 1967 beach bill was adopted and the statutory line was established. So potentially this is a look into the future, and as shoreline armoring continues up and down our coast, we're gonna probably expect to see a lot more of this as we go through time. It's kind of unnerving. So before I sign off, I'm just gonna pose these questions for our consideration. What is right for Oregon and what is at stake with our public beaches? Are the current policies for shoreline armoring sustainable and at what cost? And there are trade-offs that we all have to consider as this discussion moves forward, and what are those trade-offs? And do we really want to try to save special places for our future, in particular our public beaches and our rights to use the beaches in the future and recreate there? And so the current shoreline mitigation process for erosion, unfortunately, is reactive. So wouldn't a proactive approach be best moving forward in time, especially considering sea level rise and climate change? We know these things are taking place. The problems that go with those are manifesting themselves right now in real time, and we can go out on our own shoreline here, not far from where we live, and we can actually see it happening. So I'm going to leave the group with those questions. They're more rhetorical questions, but as we go through the night, something to think about. So that's all I've got to share with you, and I guess we're going to have some questions and answers at the end of the presentations, and so I'll stick around for that, and I'll turn it back over to Charlie.
Awesome. Hey, thanks so much, Jay. These are really great questions. I hope that those of you who are participating will ponder those questions and think about that as our next presenters are presenting. I think you set both Meg up very well here, as well as Peter is going to be talking a little bit more about what can we do now about the future and what can we think about. But we also have a lot of homes and a lot of property and a lot of infrastructure right now that we have to deal with too. And that's a lot of what Meg's job is all about. So Meg actually will be quickly leaving the end of this discussion tonight to be part of a planning commission hearing for one such property that is threatened right now and endangered along the shoreline and is looking for shoreline protection. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Meg, who's going to talk a little bit more about planning for our changing coastal areas.
Great, thank you, Charlie. Good evening, everyone. So I'm Meg Reed, Coastal Shores Specialist for the Oregon Coastal Management Program, which is administered by the Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development. I'm going to talk, as Charlie mentioned, a little bit about the land use side of things. So Jay set me up very well to talk more about the land use side of our beaches and dunes areas. Before I get into that, I'll just mention a little bit about the Oregon Coastal Management Program. It is a federally approved program by NOAA, as are most of the coastal states and territories throughout the United States. And that is a partnership between the federal government and state governments to provide federal funding to states to do coastal management that is more uniquely tailored to each state and their particular need. So in Oregon, our coastal zone is fairly large. It's watershed based, and it goes from the crest of the Coast Range out to the edge of the territorial sea, which is 3 nautical miles from shore. You can see it on the map there, the dark green and the dark blue areas. It encompasses 362 miles of coastline, 22 major estuaries, 7 counties, and 32 coastal cities. And all of those jurisdictions have to have comprehensive plans and land use ordinances that are in compliance with Oregon's coastal management zone, as well as Oregon's statewide land use planning system. So it's a very networked program. The state agency, Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development, is the administrator of both of these programs, and it is in partnership with our local governments as well as all state agencies that have permitting authority within the coastal zone, and our federal partners as well. So turning more to the statewide planning system, it is guided by 19 statewide planning goals that all cities and counties throughout the entire state of Oregon have to comply with through their local comprehensive plans. The last 4 are coastal specific. They're on estuarine resources, coastal shorelines, beaches and dunes, and ocean resources. Our commission, the Land Conservation Development Commission, sets broad policy for the agency and all of our partners. And then we are all guided by those 19 statewide planning goals, which are codified in statute and further developed in rule. And then, as I mentioned, all city and county comprehensive plans have to be in compliance with those 19 planning goals, and as well as the state agencies that have authority relating to those statewide land use planning goals. So, for example, Department of Environmental Quality, Department of State Lands, Department of Fish and Wildlife, Oregon Parks and Recreation Department, they all have authorities and they all have to be in compliance with those statewide planning goals. It is a pretty unique program that has been in Oregon since the 1970s, and it is pretty progressive in its statewide coordinated approach. So I'll focus tonight on statewide planning goal 18, which is the one on beaches and dunes, because that's what we're talking about here. So the overarching tenet of the goal is the protection and development of beach and dune areas. And there are a few specific provisions that come up the most in this goal that I want to highlight. One is that all cities and counties have to have an inventory of their beach and dune areas if they are ocean fronting. And then from that, they have the goal states that there is a prohibition on development, which includes residential, commercial, and industrial buildings on areas that are considered beaches, active dunes, and other landforms that are subject to ocean flooding. So those are areas where that type of development is just prohibited outright. There are other areas, those sections of the dune can be developed with minimal development of minimal value. So for example, beach access ways or boardwalks, decks, and things like that that have minimal value. They might be able to be in those areas, but they have to go through some other provisions. Then there's a provision on dune grading requirements. So that is in regards to if people are living on the oceanfront and they want to cut down the height of their dune for view purposes, they can do that, but only under very prescribed circumstances under the goal. They have dune height limitations of how low you can lower the dune. It has to be done on an area-wide basis and only under an approved for-dune management plan. There are only 6 on Oregon's coast at the moment, all on the north coast, north and central coast. And actually one of them with the city of Cannon Beach was just updated, and they actually do no longer allow view grading for dunes. So that is a new update. The other piece that Jay has been talking about is about beachfront protective structures, or those riprap and seawalls. And there is limitations under the goal. So those structures are only allowed to be issued where development existed on January 1st, 1977. And development is defined in the goal as houses, commercial industrial buildings, and vacant but improved subdivision lots. So meaning a statutorily divided subdivision lot that has roads and utilities to it. So basically these are areas where development was already there or development decisions already occurred as a sort of small, narrow grandfathering clause that would allow shoreline armoring to be put in those areas. But then moving forward, the intention was that oceanfront development would take hazards into account and be built in such a way that they wouldn't be requiring shoreline protection, at least from a structural point of view. As Jay pointed out, there's structural and non-structural types of erosion control treatments. And that's a very important distinction under Goal 18. So just wanted to highlight how important land use is and how important Goal 18 is in the way our landscape has been developed. So this is an aerial photo from Pacific City. On the right-hand side to the south is an area that was developed before the goal was put into effect, so in the early 60s. And you can see that development is on the crest of the foredune. It's surrounded by sand. It has chronic issues with sand inundation as well as erosion. The area to the north or on the left of the screen is a development that was done post 1977. So it was under Goal 18, the foredune development was prohibited. And so that development occurred behind the dune. And you can see the dune is vegetated, it is fairly stable, and that area is protected from erosion and flooding. So you can see very clearly the difference between pre-1970 or pre-Goal 18 and post-Goal 18 development in this picture. I also wanted to point out we have a few resources related to this for local governments, but also for anyone in the public who's interested. We did develop an inventory of eligibility, and it's on our Coastal Atlas, which is a great resource if you've never been. This one is called the Ocean Shores Online Viewer, and it does show every tax lot along the ocean front and whether it's eligible for shoreline protection or not eligible. So green is eligible, red is not eligible. It also has some other data layers, such as where beachfront protective structures exist right now, and other coastal hazards. And I just want to mention that this inventory is not a replacement for official determinations. As Jay mentioned, that determination actually happens through a land use compatibility statement that's part of the Oregon Parks and Recreation alteration permit. So the local government ultimately makes that decision on a case-by-case basis. They're all welcome to adopt this as their official inventory, but none have done so to date. So now, as we've all been talking about, there's things that we're already experiencing and will continue to experience because of the effects of climate change and specifically sea level rise. So we're trying to think about how do we use our existing framework to adapt and mitigate the impacts of climate change. So our department has been developing a few different tools that I wanted to quickly mention. One is we have mapped all of Oregon's estuaries except for the Columbia River estuary for under different sea level rise scenarios for 2030, 2050, and 2100. And then in addition to the sea level, we also added flooding chances. So 1% chance flood and a 50% chance flood. And then did a simple exposure analysis of what is at risk from those flooding scenarios. And so this is a screenshot from the Coos Bay estuary, and you can see some of those icons highlighted, what could be impacted by this flooding scenario, such as fire departments, schools, water treatment plants, airports, railroads, roads, things like that. So that's an important tool that our planners can utilize right now in helping to plan for these areas and what is most at risk. In addition to that, we are now developing a sea level rise planning guide that is meant for local governments and local planning staff. And it's hopefully a first of an upcoming resilience series that our department is putting forth. We hope to have a beta version available for our local governments in July. And that will be a chance for them to give input to us and see, is this hitting the mark? Do they need more resources? What else do they need to more effectively plan for sea level rise? So this guide will include things like the sea level rise science, what's available to them right now, and then local policy and planning, things that they can use in our existing planning frameworks. Legal context, financial options, adaptation mitigation actions, and of course, education and outreach for the community at large. How can we bring everyone on board with this kind of planning? So that's forthcoming. We're working on it right now, and we're all kind of learning as we go and seeing what others are doing. But as you'll probably hear from Peter, there's sea level rise in Oregon is very different and unique than what other coastal states are experiencing. So we do have some unique things happening here, and which is why it's important to have these localized planning tools that are specific to our state. So that's it for me, and I'll turn it over to Peter. Thank you.
Thanks, Meg, and that's a good setup for Peter while he's getting his screen share up. Peter works on the future. So we talk a lot about how do we respond to and deal with what's on the ground today. And Meg started to talk about the small part of her work that allows them to really address the future. But I know for at least Parks and Recreation and oftentimes DLCD, they're forced to be responsive and reactive to a lot of things that are on the ground. And so it's really helpful to work with scientists and that can bring together both a lot of the social aspects, the economic aspects, and a lot of the different stakeholder interests around our beaches and really model and plan scenarios for the future. So with that, I am going to stop talking about this and let Mr. Peter Rosario jump in here and talk about his work.
Thank you very much, Charlie. Really appreciate the invitation to be here, and it's just great to hear from Jay and Meg. So yeah, I can talk a little bit about some work that I've been involved with lots of colleagues and students at OSU over the last decade or so. throughout the region of Pacific Northwest, along with many, many stakeholders that have helped throughout this process, including both Meg, Jay, and Charlie. And so, as Charlie mentioned, the main thing that we're trying to do with these studies is to explore a range of alternative scenarios for the Oregon coast. And I think we could all probably imagine that if we sat down a group of Oregonians in a room and asked them about what a kind of an ideal resilient coastal future might look like, we might get a whole range of potential ideas of what that would be. But I think we could all agree that there's a lot of stressors on the environment along the coast right now in terms of coastal flooding, coastal erosion, sometimes too much sand, as Meg just alluded to. And so these are the issues that Meg and Jay have to deal with on a regular basis. And there's a lot of trade-offs in terms of how we actually approach dealing with these situations. And so the idea is to think through this range of potential climate change scenarios, as well as adaptation options in terms of thinking about the future of Oregon's coastline. Okay. There we go. Okay, so I think it's probably obvious to everybody listening that there's a range of climate controls that will be very important in terms of changing the resilience of coastal communities along the Oregon coast to both flooding and erosion. And probably the most obvious one of these is obviously a sea level rise. And so clearly there's a global mean sea level rise rate that's being documented by lots of scientists. That's actually been shown to be accelerating in recent decades. But as Meg alluded to, we really need to make sure that we're informing that global mean sea level rise rate with the regional variability that we have along the Oregon coast due to vertical land motion. And then obviously there's also a wide range of uncertainty in terms of projected future sea level rise. And so in terms of thinking about Oregon's coastal futures, it's really wise to think about that range from low potential sea level rise in the future to a very high range and everything potentially in between. Other climate controls on changing coastal flooding and erosion are things like the El Nino Southern Oscillation. So I think it's, again, fairly obvious that some of the major hazards we have in terms of flooding and erosion happen during our major El Nino events. And La Nina also brings its own challenges to the Oregon coast. There's no present day scientific consensus of what the future might actually hold in terms of ENSO. But I will say, I'm not gonna have a lot of time to go into the details, but there are some papers that are starting to show that maybe some of the extreme El Nino events, like the ones we had in 97, 98, and even 15, 16, 2015, 2016, those types of events might increase in frequency in the coming decades. And so we obviously need to be prepared for what that might do to our coastal hazards. And then finally, maybe about a decade to 15 years ago, there's a series of papers written showing that the wave heights along the Oregon coast had been increasing with time. I think if we redid that analysis today, we'd see a very different story. But I think the key takeaway from a lot of that work is that there's trends and variability in storminess patterns at kind of interannual to decadal scale, and how those storm patterns actually translate to nearshore processes and wave run up along the coast and erosion along the coast is key. And we need to take into account those kinds of changes and what climate change may bring to that into our analyses. But that's only one side of the story. Actually, before I get to that, I will say that the way we handle thinking about these different climate stretchers is by basically taking a total water level modeling approach. Again, I won't go into too many details, but basically we try to combine all these different factors like sea level rise, the potential changes to ENSO variability, as well as maybe changes to storminess patterns in terms of how high water level gets at the coastline. And that's important in terms of when property owners might actually start experiencing flooding and erosion, and when they might actually start seeking, if they're eligible, some of that riprap protection that Jay and Meg alluded to. However, beyond just those climate change drivers in terms of changing coastal community resilience to these hazards, there's also a whole suite of socioeconomic controls as well, and we have to take those into account. So clearly, new population along the coastline, how that coastline actually develops in terms of that new population, in terms of where the houses are built, the kinds of housing that's built. And then as both Jay and Meg alluded to, there's a whole suite of potential adaptation options that are available to us, some of which are used more prevalently along Oregon right now, but we can actually potentially borrow from many other places around the country or the world and think through what that range of options might bring to the Oregon coast. And in terms of thinking about what kind of options that we might have available to us, I mean, Jay outlined a lot of them in quite some detail. We've had a lot of conversations with various stakeholders over the years, and there's a whole suite of kind of questions that came up. And I think these are actually very similar to the questions that, that Jay actually left us with at the end of his talk. You know, things about how would these different adaptation measures change coastal flooding and erosion? We actually document that. You know, in terms of the implementation of different strategies, does that change development? Well, how much will things cost? Are they actually feasible to implement along the Oregon coast? And then there's also a variety of questions, again, alluded to earlier, in terms of the trade-offs, in terms of potentially protecting backshore infrastructure, but also about the accessibility of the recreation services that those beaches and dunes provide. So we need to keep those things in context as we're kind of thinking about a range of potentially of resilient Oregon coastal futures. And so basically this just kind of sets up the approach that we've taken with these projects. We've looked at the climate drivers as well as the policy drivers. And the way we kind of refer to it is we're trying to envision a whole suite of alternative futures. And another way to refer to this is explore how the complex coupled natural human systems are dynamically responding to both our adaptation approaches as well as these various climate change. And of course, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty in terms of both of those, what the sea level will be in future decades, what the influence of our responses will be along the coastline. And so we want to try to address that with various modeling techniques. And I just want to step back and just point out that, you know, of course, we already have been adapting to these kind of stressors along our coastline. And I think this came out very clearly in the talks by Jay and Meg. What I'm showing here is basically a representation of the shoreline change rate in Tillamook County, actually between 1967, when that statutory vegetation line that Jay talked about was first derived, to the early to mid 2000s. Basically what this shows is everything to the right of this black vertical line here shows areas along that coastline that were eroding over that 35-year period, and then a few areas to the left of that line that were actually accreting. So this is kind of really what Jay was pointing out in terms of the coastline is continuously evolving. And at least along the coastline of Tillamook County in this time period, there was quite a bit of erosion. However, there are plenty of places that are also experiencing a lot of excess sand. So Meg mentioned places along the coastline that have dune management plans and actually grade dunes for improved views. And so that's been happening in places like Pacific or Manzanita, as well as Pacific City. There's also plenty of areas like Rockaway Beach, Nesquin, that have been eroding for a couple of decades now. And the primary adaptation that we've implemented along that stretch of coastline has been this hardening, this riprap revetments that Jay alluded to. And so I just want to point out that we have been witnessing adaptation to these various stressors along the coast for quite some time. And we can use a lot of that information in terms of making models about what might happen into the future. And so that's exactly what we've tried to do with these various projects. We use a tool that's basically a dynamic GIS system referred to as Envision, that a colleague of mine, John Bolte here at OSU, has developed. And basically what this allows us to do is in a very spatially explicit way. And here I'm showing a part of the Rockaway coastline. We know where we have a variety of landscape data that is implemented in the model. So we know where various population centers are. We know where the improvements on that landscape have been made in terms of the various development patterns. We also can implement in the model basically population growth trends and actually new development along the Oregon coast with various models. I mentioned the total water level modeling approach that we take to incorporate sea level rise, El Nino variability, maybe changes patterns of storminess. So that's all included in terms of relatively simple models that are also evolving this kind of dynamic landscape. And then finally, we basically are going to kind of perturb the model or force the model with a range of climate change impact scenarios. And those are going to be based upon sea level rise forecasts, as well as a range of kind of policy scenario narratives that are really going to describe how one might adapt to the changing environment with various adaptation, okay? And then finally, again, because everyone's definition of resilience might be slightly different, we could explore a whole range of different resilience metrics at multiple timeframes into the future and look at some of the trade-offs that I alluded to earlier. Okay, so it's a little bit about how we We forced this model first. I mentioned climate change scenarios. I'm just going to show details for some of the sea level rise forecasts that we're using. We're basically using some of the latest kind of nationwide probabilistic sea level rise forecasts that exist. These are from the National Climate Assessment that came out in 2017. So these are actually probabilistic forecasts of the future of sea level rise based upon a range of different possible emission scenarios from the last IPCC report that came out a few years ago. And the details aren't really important, but basically I referred to this earlier. There's a wide range of variability in terms of what the future of sea level rise might hold along the Oregon coast. These values are modified locally to account for vertical land motion, so we can develop those local projections, but we can actually, based upon a particular emission scenario, global emission scenario, we can actually assign a probability of future sea level rise through time along the Oregon coast. Okay, and I'm going to borrow here from, actually, this video, I think will show, if I have this laser, I'm going to take that off for a second, and show an example of kind of how we implement these kinds of forecasts into the modeling. So this is an actual video that Jay Senowalk took along this select pit a couple of years ago, and basically showing a time period where winter storm was impacting the toe of a dune, and occasionally water was overtopping and impacting the infrastructure behind that. And so we have sea level rise curves that we're implementing in the modeling framework, but based upon our ability to actually quantify the total water level, so also the wave component of total water levels experienced at the coastline, we can actually make assessments through time with this approach of how often this kind of event might actually occur. We can certainly try to quantify how often it might have occurred in the recent historical time period. But basically with our modeling approaches, we can see that this kind of event, if we say the crest of this dune feature is maybe about 6 meters or so relative to a particular datum, that might occur only once every couple of years in the present time period. But as we go into the future decades, we see that with various sea level rise scenarios, that's starting to occur several times per year, and then potentially every spring neap tide cycle out towards the end of the century. And so these are the kinds of triggers that we're going to implement in the model in terms of when different homeowners might want to implement different adaptation strategies on the landscape. Okay, so how do we, I mentioned earlier, we have had a lot of conversations with various stakeholders over the years. Here's some photographs from some of those meetings and discussions, where we kind of talked about a variety of, again, potential coastal futures, different policies that could be implemented, some of which are already being implemented along the coast. Some might be new, some might involve relaxing existing policies. And we want to explore kind of the full range of possibility of what might the future of Oregon coastline look like. And so we came up with a range of policy kind of narratives to look at. Obviously, we'd look at what would happen if we didn't change any existing present day policies. So that's the status quo. So, very much as Meg and Jay laid out in terms of how Goal 18 is implemented along the coastline right now, we tried to come up with ways to implement that in the modeling framework. We also looked at scenarios that involved folks that really wanted to prioritize holding the line and actually strengthening shoreline armoring to preserve the infrastructure primarily. There were even folks in some of these early meetings that wanted to look at a laissez-faire, so really kind of relaxing a lot of the policies that exist. But there was an equal number of people interested in policies along the lines of a realigned scenario. So these are more, I think Charlie referred to them as managed retreat. So policies that are implemented that involved changing human activities and maybe removing infrastructure along the coast as sea level rises into the future. And then there's a variety of other kind of hybrid approaches we looked at either as well, and I'm not going to get into the details. But the bottom line, this is a busy plot, and all I really want to point out with this plot is that we basically derived through these meetings, workshops with a variety of stakeholders, a range of different policies and policy scenarios that we implemented into this model and vision. We're going to cross that with a range of climate change scenarios covering this full range of low to high sea level, increasing or decreasing El Niños into the future, increasing or decreasing wave heights into the future, and look at a range of these different potential Oregon coastal futures against a suite of resilience metrics, again, defined by the stakeholders that we talked to over the series of workshops. All right, so I'm going to give a couple of quick examples to kind of set the tone of the kinds of things that we can do with this kind of modeling approach. So for example, we can look at the effect of some policies on development patterns. I mentioned that this model can actually implement new population along the Oregon coast and show where they might develop kind of a conceptual framework. And so we can actually invoke various adaptation policies that maybe would prevent further development within a hazard zone. So in this case, we're actually looking at what if there was a new policy that basically prevented further development within existing hazard zones that Jonathan Allen and Dogami have developed over the years, and potentially even removed buildings within those hazard zones that were subject to repeated hazards over the years, according to our models. And then we could look at, as I said, a variety of different resilience metrics, such as a time series plot like what I'm showing here on the right-hand side, that is basically showing over time the number of buildings within this particular hazard zone. You can just think of this as, you know, a stretch of coast that's relatively close to the dynamic shoreline that is potentially impacted by hazards now and into the future. And based upon these different management strategies, so manage realignment or retreat from the shoreline, you would actually see a reduction of buildings within that hazard zone. But in some of these other approaches where new development is going into the along the coastline, the laissez-faire, the hold the line policies, we're seeing a slight increase in the number of buildings within that hazard zone. So these are the kinds of metrics that this kind of modeling can actually show us. We can actually even quantify the number of buildings that would need to be transitioned potentially into easements under a realign kind of approach. And so obviously this would take a significant amount of resources to do, but the modeling framework and vision allows us to at least ask some of these questions. What's come up a lot in discussion tonight has been armoring along the coastline. And so clearly there's lots of data sets out there. And thanks to Jay and Meg for providing a lot of information to us over the years. We know where the existing armoring is along the coastline. So here I'm looking at more or less the present day of the Rockaway Beach littoral cell from the Tillamook Bay North Jetty to the Nehalem Bay South Jetty. And we know where that existing armoring is at present day. But Meg just showed a few minutes ago that database that shows which properties are eligible associated with Goal 18 for future armoring. And so as sea level potentially rises and potentially changes in storminess, the models that are based upon what's happened in the recent historical would suggest that some property owners might want to actually continue to armor. And these are the kinds of products that we can actually develop in terms of at least the spatial variability of new armoring applications at different time periods into the future. So I'm showing 2040, 2060, 2100 under a status quo scenario where most of this stretch of shoreline is actually presently eligible for armoring. And I don't want people to get too caught up on the specifics of the timeline here. This is very much a model that is subject to a lot of uncertainty. And clearly this is for one sea level rise, but allows us to ask some questions and quantify the influence of some various different policy scenarios. What's been talked about a lot tonight thus far is trade-offs associated with some of the various policies. And so once the shoreline is armored without additional work, such as beach nourishment, keeping a wide beach, as sea level rises, you might start getting a situation where you have less and less of an accessible beach. So this is just an example of a time period in which you can walk or fly a kite or ride a horse along the north-south corridor, as Jay put it, for some stretch of the coastline, but other stretches where waves are impacting that hard revetment. You reduce some of that accessibility, potentially reducing some safety as well. And so we can, again, working with stakeholders, we define various metrics for beach accessibility. We can make maps of what that might look like in present day. And we can make maps of what that looked like at different time periods. This is just an example for what things might look like at the end of the century under a range of different policy scenarios. And so under status quo and laissez-faire, you can imagine when a lot of the coastline becomes armoring, sea level has risen significantly, very little of this coastline might be actually accessible or safe along at this later in the century time period. But there are other possible adaptation measures such as realigning or much more significant beach nourishment potentially, which would again cost a lot of resources. that could keep a safe and accessible beach open, at least for part of the of this coastline. So these are the kinds of things that we can address with this kind of modeling framework. And here's just a slightly different way to look at more or less the same set of results. But if you don't like maps, if you like time series, this is the percent of that Rockaway Beach shoreline that is, at least according to our model, that would be hardened via these riprap coastal protection structures through time and other various different policy scenarios. And then what I'm showing on the right-hand side is basically the reduction in the accessibility of that coastline through time. And again, a huge amount of variability, that basically the width of these different color bars represents the variability associated with these different policy scenarios. And I'm just showing really one primary climate change scenario for these results right now. So I could just end with just some quick conclusions about this kind of work. These suite of projects, the Envisioning Resilient Coastal Futures projects, I feel like have been helpful, particularly for the researchers, but hopefully also for stakeholders to explore, visualize, and quantify some of the effects that a changing climate, as well as some changing management policies on the coast, will have for our Oregon coastal futures. We feel that's a fairly transferable approach. We've done projects in Tillamook County, Oregon, Grace Harbor County, Washington. We're now back in Oregon looking at a statewide model. We're doing a lot of this work in a very probabilistic approach, so we can actually incorporate the uncertainty with the climate change projections that I mentioned to you. And then these metrics hopefully allow us to start considering some of the trade-offs, cost benefits, pros and cons of these various adaptation measures. And ideally, a lot of this work is meant to increase adaptive capacity of our various communities. I'm just going to show one more quick plot before I end this portion of the program, and to show that we could actually even quantify kind of the relative influence of human decision-making, as well as kind of climate change uncertainty on landscape metrics. And in this case, we're basically looking at the number of buildings that our modeling is showing might be impacted by coastal flooding within Tillamook County. And in this case, the colors of this figure on the right-hand side represent the different policy scenarios, and the dashed, bright colored line represents kind of a median value for a range of different climate change scenarios. Again, that is variation between low sea level rise to high sea level rise, changing storming patterns into the future. But the point is that the within color variation, which is based upon the climate change uncertainty, is actually less than the intra-color variability, which is based upon these different policy options that we have in decision-making that we have in front of us. And so the point here is that the adaptation measures that the Oregon coast employs over coming decades can have a very significant impact on our hopefully resilient Oregon coastal futures. And I'll leave you with a couple of final thoughts, and I won't go through them orally, but thanks very much for having me.
All right, thanks, Peter. And we'll leave those final thoughts up there for a minute. And if our other panelists want to join and turn their cameras back on, that would be awesome. And I'd love to open it up for questions from our audience. And actually, there was one that kind of came in that I thought was an interesting question, and maybe I can ponder this to the group a little bit. And it was sort of the recognizing that both hardened structures, like in the case of the Bay Ocean community and the jetty there that was built, can create major erosive events, but also climate change, and can exacerbate essentially just how dynamic this beach zone is, I think. And so there's two sort of driving factors there, right? Both our hardening and other structures that we may put along the coast, but also, climate change. And how do we plan around both of those things? And when there's a lot of fingers to point in a lot of different directions.
I can try.
a shot at answering this question in the Q&A.
You did, Peter? Is that what you said?
No, it says it looks like Jay might have answered.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm just sort of weighing it out to the group here,
Okay.
to respond to and to think about. And you know, in if we're with respect for one over the other, you know, which is exacerbating maybe the dynamic nature of our beaches more? Is it the placement of hardened structures and static things, and or is it climate change, or is it sort of the combination of the two? Us sort of responding one way or another.
So Charlie, I would just argue that there's so many factors involved here, and it's hard to point to any one thing. The truth of it is that it's a reality. We have to face it. You know, it doesn't help to point fingers, except that if you have a real obvious target. But in a case like this, we have to deal with the policy more than anything. Just figure out what we're going to do.
And I can potentially add to that. I think we should consider what kind of structures we're talking about in terms of the impacts on the coastline. So, you know, the question was specifically about the jetties at Tillamook Bay. And so those jetties, as well as jetties in other locations, particularly the mouth of the Columbia River, had, you know, very significant impacts on coastal changes. A lot of times, jetties result in a significant amount of accumulation of material. And so the North Jetty of Tillamook, of course, caused, you know, the famous story of Bay Ocean, but there was also a lot of accumulation in the southern stretch of Twin Rocks and Rockaway Beach littoral cell area. And at the mouth of the Columbia River, just massive amounts of changes along the Clatsop Plains, as well as on the Washington side along the Long Beach Peninsula. And so those jetties, obviously in place for navigational purposes and commerce and safety, et cetera, have had massive decadal scale changes on various coastlines. I'd say that's much more of an impact than a lot of the shore parallel structures that we've been mostly talking about tonight in terms of the revetments and the riprap revetments, seawalls, et cetera. Those might have some localized impacts on adjacent properties occasionally. Obviously, there's the beach squeeze issue that we've kind of been alluding to as sea level rises. But I think it's important to distinguish between the kinds of structures in terms of thinking about their impacts on the coastline.
And I would add, from a planning perspective, right now in our current land use regulations, we don't require sea level rise to be included in impact analyses of these structures or development, you know, houses being built on the oceanfront and so on. So that's something that could change and might change in the future. But I would just want to highlight that that's, you know, we can't force development decisions to be based around sea level rise projections at this moment in time, but it is a hope that that will be more incorporated going forward.
So another question, there's a lot of lots and places that are undeveloped that are eligible potentially for hardening. And is there any consideration to preventing you know, the inevitable, which is potentially that someone develops in those areas that are prone to hazards, and then inevitably is forced to respond with a shoreline protective structure?
So really, it's just whatever the local regulations are. We're only as good as our regulations, really. So if it kind of depends, while we have these statewide planning goals that set broad policy, they still can be implemented in very specific ways from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So, you know, for example, Lincoln City has a setback requirement that's based on erosion rates, but that is not the same everywhere. So, you know, if we want to see development have different practices, then regulations have to be updated and changed at a local level. And our agency tries to support that as much as possible, but it's sort of a voluntary system right now. If they're meeting minimum requirements, so we can't force them to change, but we can provide incentives like funding to do projects. But again, that kind of gets done on a sort of small level, like jurisdiction by jurisdiction. It's not, there aren't any necessarily, there's no statewide setback requirement, for example. It's something that we've considered, but we don't have really good data for the entire coastline yet to base that on. So it's another thing that could be changed, but at the moment it's not there.
One of the things I think about is that our local governments are really incentivized to develop these properties, right? They get tax money from them. And so I'm curious if there's state incentives, or that there's been any consideration of programs that would incentivize local jurisdictions to not develop in these hazard zones.
We're seeing more of that, like at the like funding resilience scale sort of thing. Like for example, credit rating systems actually start taking local policies into account. So you might get a better bond rating for your city if you have more restrictive policies for oceanfront development, as an example. So there are becoming more, like from insurance companies and bonding and those kinds of angles. I think there's more incentive for there to be more restrictive development standards and that take flooding and erosion and sea level rise and things like that into account. Also, if a community makes a, like a stance on something that, they don't want to do any more hardening ever, whatever we have is that's it, we're not doing any more, we'll be more restrictive than the goal. If they make those more known, then they can also protect themselves from liability claims and takings claims from like a private property perspective. So we are starting to see these lessons come out from other places that are experiencing sea level rise at a greater rate, on the East Coast, for example. And so I think the legal framework is still kind of young in this area, but it is definitely developing quickly, and there's a lot of lessons to be learned. I don't know if others have thoughts, but.
Peter or Jay, you have thoughts on that?
Well, Meg, thanks for the very thorough rundown there. You covered a lot of ground, and we are definitely challenged, and it'll be interesting to see where this all goes. And I'll try to continue helping where I can in these discussions. And I want to thank both Peter and Meg for their very good presentations, and thank Charlie for being giving me the opportunity to join you all and share.
So Jay, I have a question, with respect to our public beaches and, the response to climate change impacts and coastal erosion. There's a lot of areas like Glen Eden where it's primarily armored. And like you said, there's not a lot of beach to walk on. And, we've touched a little bit on sometimes these hardened structures really contribute to further erosion on the beach and sort of exacerbate the steepness of the beach. Do you see areas of the coast that are just going to really likely go away? And maybe this is a question both for you and Peter, who does the modeling on this. And I think Peter would say, well, that depends on how you respond to the erosion. But I'm kind of curious where I think we can probably hone in on some areas of the coast that are most important and most in question. And also we talked a little bit about sea level rise, and some areas may actually gain a little beach potentially over time. And I think it's worth just, kind of talking a little bit about that, because Oregon is a little unique in that sense. And I think that's some of what Meg was alluding to with her local guidance around sea level rise planning.
Yeah, so I'll speak to that. So if you want to see a really good example of a beach that's disappearing, like even a better example than Glen Eden Beach would be Neskowin. So Neskowin, over the past 25 years, has undergone this really big change where I have a really good friend who had a family beach home there and grew up at Neskowin on weekends, lived in Salem, and grew up surfing there. And he said that the house there, his mom had a dinner bell, and him and his brother used to go out and play in the dunes way out in front of the house. There's this big dune field and then this big broad beach, and mom would have to go out and ring the big dinner bell for the kids to come in when it was time, because she couldn't even see them. They're out there in the dunes. And If you look today, right in front of that same house, especially in the wintertime, there's no beach. You cannot safely walk on the beach in the wintertime except extreme low tide. And this time of year, the sand comes up a little bit, but it's almost like one big breakwater now at Neskowin for most of the winter in an average year. And another observation about Neskowin is that the ghost forest, there at the south end of the beach up against the headland, it used to be a rare sight to see it, and it's 365 days a year now. You can walk down there at low tide and see hundreds and hundreds of ghost forest stumps sticking up. So it's a long-term trend. I'm afraid that the beaches are going away, and this is probably the best example that I can give on the Oregon coast.
Well, that's the doom and gloom, but I don't think it's everywhere, right?
Not yet.
Peter, would you concede that some places on the north coast or south coast may look a little different?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So I showed a time series, well, the maps in the time series plot for a small subsection of the full Tillamook County coastline. So that's the what we call the Rockaway Beach sublittoral cell between the Tillamook Bay North Jetty and the Hallam Bay South Jetty. And so that, showed based upon our modeling and some future scenarios where 60 to 70% of that stretch of coastline may be eventually armored. And then again, based upon sea level rise scenarios, you get the loss of accessibility. But if you actually looked at the full, and I just didn't show it tonight, the full stretch of the Tillamook County coastline, the percentage of shoreline that is actually armored is much less, obviously, than 60%. It's probably less than 20%, even going forward into the future. I don't remember the numbers right off the top of my head. And so again, from the full stretch of Tillamook County shoreline, the accessibility impact is less when you average it over a 75-kilometer stretch of coastline as opposed to a 9-kilometer stretch of coastline. And so, basically that means that, going to places that are undeveloped, the actual state parks, there's potentially, those areas will still erode with sea level rise and potentially future climate changes, impacts on storms, but we won't be armoring those undeveloped shorelines. And there's a lot of it along the Oregon coast still. So we're definitely not in a situation like our friends and neighbors in California to the south, or the East Coast situation that Meg referred to earlier, New Jersey coastline, for example. So we do have lots of areas that it will still be accessible and unarmored because of the lack of development.
Yeah, I think the Oregon coast is fairly unique. I'm sure that's no surprise to anyone compared to other parts of the country. And it's just less developed. It has more challenging geography with the Coast Range to our backs. So there's just not as much room for development. So there's just less development anyway. And I would say generally, most of the armoring that we see is in Tillamook and Lincoln counties, where most of the people are on the coast. To the south, on the south coast, a lot of land on the oceanfront is in public hands. It's either federally, state, or locally controlled. And so those areas are not eligible for armoring, and they're not developed anyway. And so those areas, I think, will be much more resilient moving forward. There's definitely hot spots, like Gold Beach, definitely has some more erosion problems and some armoring happening. So I think there are still some hot spots, but I would say in general, from Lane County south, we have some pretty big beaches that don't have development up against them, and they're not armored, and so they will be more resilient moving forward. So even Clatsop County, there's certainly areas that are highly eroding and definitely more developed, but there are also places that have huge expanses of dune fields in front of them that are vegetated and forested, and so I think those areas will have a lot more of a buffer. Hopefully it will continue to be the case. So I think it's kind of specific in some areas, and those will probably get worse, but there are lots of other places that will be doing pretty well.
Yeah, and I got some great comments in here from folks. The master of sand science here in Oregon, Jonathan Allen, chimed in that there are places gaining sand, and he was particularly pointing out the northern half of Bay Ocean, and the Hallam Spit is gained, and most of the Clatsop plains continue to accrete. yeah, I see one of our beach rangers who's always down on the beach here chimed in as well that Agate Beach is also getting wider and really honed in on the fact that Glen Eden and Rockaway are really good examples of sort of risk areas where we're losing a lot of beach. The armoring is certainly going to lead to a loss of access, and already has in many of these places. So appreciate all of the experts out there, both on the beaches and the sciences of the beaches here, chiming in and helping us out. So I guess one question I have is what is the role of the public here and the future of our public beaches? I mean, we've talked a lot about what planners do and what the government does and what state agencies are able to do and working with. But what about the people that just want to go to the beach and care about the future of their beaches? I mean, what do you guys recommend as how they get involved? And I obviously have my own recommendations, but as a lot of the folks that are involved in foremost science and planning and also management, what do you recommend?
I mean, I think it's a lot of just being involved in your public processes, which I know can feel confusing and daunting and overwhelming sometimes, but that is probably the best place to make your voices heard, is at local planning meetings and like city council meetings, Board of County Commissioner meetings. When these kinds of things are coming up for debate, it's important for elected leaders to know what is important to their constituencies, and that if people care about armoring or their public beaches or whatever it is, that they know. And then at the state level, the same thing, at the state representatives and senators, it's really, they want to hear from you, and they do listen when you do talk to them. And so I think it is really important for people to let their elected officials know what they care about and what they want to see in policies, because it can really make a big difference.
Thanks, Meg. Jay.
Yeah, well, I'll reiterate what I mentioned in my short presentation, which is that OPRD welcomes and encourages public comments on these shoreline protection structures and other shoreline alterations. And so if you're interested in finding out or being alerted about these, you can call our office, get a hold of me, and I'll get you in touch with the right person, and we can take people's contact information and put it on a list of parties that we blast these public notices out to every time there's a shoreline alteration. And you can even do it for the county that you're in if you're only interested about local issues. So again, public participation is a really important component of OPRD's process and in the permitting decision process. So I encourage people to do that.
Charlie, would you mind if I put a plug in for people getting involved in community science?
Please do. I was going to turn it over to you next.
Okay, great. So there's a variety of ways that folks get involved in a whole suite of kind of scientific endeavors. One, which is really great, I think is really led out of Meg's office in terms of the King Tides project. And that's a great way, get out, do some beach watching during some safe beach watching during some king tides during the fall and the winter season, take some pictures. So it really helps us and lots of folks visualize what maybe future sea level rise would look like. It also helps us identify areas that are vulnerable already along the coastline that maybe we haven't been mapping in other ways. So that's one area. I have a colleague who's an ecologist here at OSU. Her name is Sally Hacker. Her and her students have actually discovered a hybridized beach grass species in the last couple of years. And so this is a kind of an aside, but a lot of the coastal dunes that we're talking about, the types of grasses that are growing in those coastal dunes actually have a big impact on the way they evolve and the heights that they grow to, and can actually be important for a variety of the recreation, ecosystem and coastal protection services that dunes provide. And anyway, this hybridized beach grass species, there is a community science program to identify. It's been, I think, identified in about a dozen places within the Pacific Northwest, and it potentially could have significant impacts on on dunes in the future. And then, I mentioned several of the workshops that we have had in terms of kind of developing input into this envisioning coastal futures approach. We've done that with a lot of in-person meetings, and those have always been kind of you all come, open to everybody that is interested. We've had those kinds of sessions at the State of the Coast meetings, which happens annually. I think the next one's going to be either October or November of this coming fall. And so there's just lots of opportunities to kind of get involved in some of the science that's happening along the coastline.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much to all of our panelists. I really appreciate all the work that you do and spending your time this evening chatting with us. I think we'll try and finish just a little bit early since I think some of us actually have a planning commission to get meeting to get to for this this very thing. Speaking of engaging with your local governments, we've got a little bit of that coming up tonight. So Tillamook County has a planning commission meeting tonight. If you want to get your feet wet and learn more about that, you can go online to Tillamook County's website and sign on to a hearing tonight. But Jonathan Allen put something in the comments that I'll leave you with, and that there's places on the Oregon coast that we've kind of lost to development. We've rip-rapped, we've hardened. The beach is less accessible there, and it's going to be harder to make gains in those areas. And some of that stuff, there's other places on our coast that are less developed and are still wild and open and really important to Oregonians. And those are the public beaches that we all know and love and are important to us. And they're worth saving. And so it's important for us to look at these proactive measures, to pick our head up, not be reactive to every single little case on the coast, and think about what are the special places that we want to protect, and what is the future of engaging and protecting our public beaches. So thank you for everyone for joining tonight. And with that, we will close our session.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody.